This lecture is about systems development. As a future business professional, you will be involved in the development of new technology applications to your business, just like you will be for our client this semester. You may take the lead in developing an IS project, or you might be an office manager who implements procedures, trains the people in the use of systems, or you might be a business analyst and work as a liaison between users and the technical staff, which is a really, really important skill to have. If nothing else, you may be asked to provide requirements and to test the system to ensure those requirements have been met. Whatever your role, it is important that you understand how processes and systems are developed and managed. This is one of my favorite little cartoons. I hope you enjoy it. SDLC, Systems Development Life Cycle. This is a kind of a carpet term for several different methodologies for developing an information system. The most crucial part of developing a system for someone else, or even for yourself, is to know what you want or know what the client wants. And pretty much the gist of this little cartoon is that, you know, it's always a communication thing. You have to ask the right questions, and as a client or a user, you have to know a lot about your needs. And oftentimes, the client can't articulate their needs and they can't express it very well, and the developer can't really ask the right questions or doesn't ask the right questions. That's why you have what we have here, which is how the customer explained it, and at the end, something completely different is gotten out of it. So the lesson here is think carefully about what you want to ask the client as you go into the process of doing this project. Now, we will go through some of the phases of the systems development life cycle. And the SDLC is actually a very traditional process. It's often illustrated in a circular way because it's recursive. Basically, you do everything that you need to do, and then after it's all done, you have to do some things over again. Basically, that means systems development is an ongoing cycle. And you probably know this instinctively when you consider the software that you use daily, right? Microsoft is always in development with its software. It is always releasing new versions and releasing fixes for the mistakes they made in the new versions. Anybody who has an iPhone kind of knows that same situation is true for the iOS. The newest one that comes out sometimes is a little buggy and they have to re-release it. But ideally, what you need to do is figure out at the outset that you need something. So you have information or you have data that you need to store and use. You need to figure out that you need it. And when you do, then you have to figure out what it entails. And so if you kind of look at the third box there on the way down where it says project plan, it says determine requirements. We're in that particular area right now. And these things are difficult to determine at times. We have, as we saw in the project management tool, the higher level goals. And those are easy to generalize. We need to store data. That is one of the few things that you get right off the bat. But you need to break that down into more detailed requirements, basically. And yes, you need to store data, but for what? And even the answer to the for what needs to be broken down further. So this is all key on the client interview. The client interview is coming up for you after the exam. We're going to be working on developing questions and thought processes in order to get the best information we can from the client in that interview. From that interview, you're going to have a list of things that the information system has to do, either in general, well, definitely in general, and definitely in detail, involving the step-by-step process. You're going to be responsible for maintaining your project and managing it through the project management tool. And so one of the things you'll learn in K204 is how to effectively manage a project, at least in the short term. So once you have determined the business requirements, after that is when you begin to design your system. As experts in Access right now, you are ahead of the client in many ways, because you know what the system can do. So you are familiar with the objects that are in the system. Forms, reports, tables, queries. And so you can very easily achieve business requirements by developing components of this information system. After you're done designing and building the system components, then you implement. And you're rarely in the position to implement, although you're welcome to come back and do that as in a voluntary capacity. But implementation means you're putting it into use, and there are several ways that things are put into use. And we've got a couple of different ways that we look at it: waterfall, iterative model, rapid development, and Scrum. Okay. I've got a few videos embedded in this particular slideshow coming up. This is a long video. I'm not going to really play it for you, but you can go get it on YouTube or you can download these slides. What is Agile development? And it's not a very long video, probably much shorter than this lecture is going to be, but it is very good at explaining a different kind of approach rather than a stepped method that we just saw. You do one part and then you do the next part and then you do the next part. As you're developing the information system, it can be organized in many different ways. So give this a look. And Scrum, here's another one, another way of operating. We might even kind of work in this way in a way. This is something you might consider thinking about. So watch that video too at your leisure. So I talked about defining the system. The very first thing that we're doing here is asking ourselves, as I said before, what the system has to do and what are the necessary features. Sometimes we get caught into a loop with the client where they have given you what they want and need, and then later on they start thinking about different things that they might like to have, which may be beyond the scope of the project or the system's design. You just need to kind of break it down to what features are absolutely necessary for the function of this business and to fulfill the business requirements. Then you start breaking down cost and other feasibility factors where you can kind of guess at how much this is going to be costing them. And of course that's a factor. For us, it's costing us time. And basically that, and time is one of our limitations. So basically that's what we have to come down with. What's feasible for our time period? We've got your project teams formed. So think about sitting down with your team at some point and deciding what exactly each person could be responsible for, or if it will be an entirely team effort where everybody pitches in on each component. And then plan the project. Basically, this is assigning tasks, determining deadlines, and figuring out what needs to come first, what needs to come next, etc. For example, you can't write a query until the tables are done. You can't have the database objects created until the data is cleansed, etc., etc. So the next part of this is, what do you do? I talked about this at the beginning when we were looking at the systems development life cycle. Not the cartoon, but the next slide, the illustration of the life cycle. I'm doing really well. Sorry about this, guys. But as I said, the user interviews are really, really important. They're pivotal. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. So we know our client has an existing system, and it is QuickBooks. I suggest very strongly that you go in and take a look at the QuickBooks website. There is a support area where they have some videos actually available for you so that you can look at what the system is doing and what it does. I suggest you get really familiar with that. I was going to try to embed those videos here, but I decided against that. Go look at them. I think that would be very helpful for you. Consider every part of an information system. People, processes, all of it. You have to consider all of this in order to create a good system. And you need to absolutely make sure that the requirements are what you need. So if the requirements you determine are wrong, the system is going to be wrong. And the more completely that you figure out what the requirements are, then design and implementation will be a lot easier and more successful. As we are designing, so once you have your list of requirements, find out what the user has already. In other words, if you're designing on Office 2016 and he's running Office 2000, for example, or something like that, then there might be an issue with the software and the hardware. They've got an old machine. Find out what they've got. If they don't have compatible software, some of the features might not work. Designing the application can start with a macro. In other words, we need an Access database and we need an Excel application as well in order to fully look at data the way that our client needs to look at it. So you're going to decide in the general, we need two compatible applications, preferably connected and preferably in some way able to pull in data from QuickBooks. And then you start deciding about the components that go into the application. In the database sense, it involves some design issues, which we'll talk about in the next class. But a good database design determines how well you meet your business requirement. How well you structure your data determines how good the information you get from it is. Structuring the data severely limits how you can access it, no pun intended. So you really, really do need to be careful about that. Basically, implementation, I tend to disagree with implementation being a build portion of it. I really think creation is its own step. But it depends on the methodology you're employing. So if you're doing it to where you're doing it in discrete steps, design, and then building the database and Excel application, and then implementing it or putting it into use, that's one way of looking at it. But people operate differently. When you watch the videos on Agile and Scrum, you'll understand that sometimes you're building system components and immediately testing them, and then integrating them and then testing those, etc., etc. So, and you're doing this almost simultaneously. And at times you can implement your system piecemeal. So, for example, IU. We've changed learning tools several times over the course of the years. Our learning environments recently have gone from, we used to have our own website in K204. Then we started to use, as a course delivery, OnCourse. And the option was given to the people university-wide to implement that gradually. In other words, they weren't forced into the whole thing right away. They had a chance to get used to it. The same thing occurred with Canvas. It was, I think, at least 2 or 3 years of slowly requiring people to get used to Canvas, be able to bring their materials over to Canvas. So most of the time you're talking about an implementation process that takes place over time. And so during that implementation process, especially for things like Canvas, lots of bugs were worked out. I can remember that in K201, K204, because there are so many students, we have to deliver the course in a certain way, and Canvas did not meet all our needs. It did not meet all of our business requirements. And interestingly, we weren't asked what we needed either. So there's a whole kind of thing that you have to consider when it comes down to building a system and how you're going to do it. And again, back to that interview, you need to talk to the stakeholders. You need to find out how they work, what their processes are, and what they want. And here are some more interesting things. I tend to think that you can observe all of these particulars here as ongoing, and like the Scrum, it's kind of a phase, a sprint, a phase, and testing and implementation, and then another development situation. But in the maintenance phase, and I actually would call this the implementation phase as well, where you are doing a live production test, basically, and you're finding out what failed. You're finding out exactly what you need to do more of, things that the user is going to request. And so, therefore, back to the Microsoft example, back to the Canvas example, all of these things are happening in what they call the maintenance phase. You're giving them the software, they are coming back with critique, basically. As we're converting a system, this implementation and maintenance is a system conversion. And this is basically what I was talking about. I tend to get ahead of myself on these things, but recall what I was talking about with Canvas. Basically, they kind of do a pilot in some ways. They give a small test population. There are many voluntary committees you can belong to where you test new kinds of systems for the university. And you don't have to, but that's their like their focus group. They get to go in and use stuff and see how it goes. And the whole university doesn't fail if it fails. So that's part of it. Years ago, we went into a phased system when it came to our student information systems. It's a PeopleSoft, which was software that was designed to do a lot of different things for the university, and you interact with it daily. Schedules and fees and courses and all kinds of stuff was involved in this PeopleSoft implementation. And it was implemented in phases. So certain things turned over at certain times. For example, the registrar didn't jump right in. There were things that they did beforehand. In other words, things gradually went into from paper and pencil and filling out a little Scantron or a little punch card or whatever into fully electronic, fully online system. Grades also. We phased out grades. We used to turn in grades on paper. We don't anymore. They gradually put that into use. Student rosters were no longer delivered by paper, etc. So each piece is taken and put into use and tested. People give them feedback on it. Parallel, I can't even imagine. Interestingly, I think what our project is going to be this semester is going to be somewhat parallel in use, because it has to be. QuickBooks is something he has to use. Therefore, we will be doing implementation in parallel, where he's going to have the old system and we're going to find a way to get that old system to interact with a new system. In the real world, this is, I think it's basically crazy, because it's crazy expensive and really confusing to the users, I think. And finally, the plunge, which, yeah, you don't want to do that. You don't want to roll something out and then take the old stuff away right away. We just can't do that. That's just not a thing that's safe. And again, even if it isn't vital to the business, it's still kind of a strange thing to do and kind of risky. It's like the Evel Knievel of systems development. You just kind of ride that motorcycle right off the ledge and hope you land safely. So, I'm sure this is all pretty much common sense. If you think long and hard, anything that you do kind of involves these steps. You decide how you want to break this down, and so that's what you're doing with your project management tool. In real life, you'll estimate time and costs. In our situation, you're going to estimate time. That's what you're paying for in time. This is what it's costing you as well. You're going to create your plan. In other words, map out whatever basically you know you have to do. Again, project management tool is going to help you with that. And then, of course, it's going to have to make adjustments. You're going to have to give things up, for example, that you can't do in time. So mission critical things have to get done, but the really cool things that you thought up might not get done. So you have to prioritize. And of course, figure out a way to deal with problems. There's always something that's going to go wrong. Trust me on this. One of these things that you kind of look at this and it's almost like a triangle. And you've got time, scope, and cost. Cost is time for us. Scope, if we kind of go back to that silly little cartoon, scope can get out of hand quickly. And so when you're deciding what your business requirements are, decide and stick to them. Do not get sucked into that thing where one of you says, oh, hey, we can do this other thing too. It would be really cool if we could XYZ. You name it, you can think it up. And a lot of you are really good at brainstorming. You can't let that, or what the client brainstorms, get in the way of your project. Not that it's always set in stone, but it should be somewhat set in stone so that you are not going way out of scope. That's called scope creep. And so that's something to kind of think about. You don't want to go too high on the requirements, get more requirements, it's going to cost more, it's going to take more time, and it throws your whole project off. Think carefully before you start doing more than what you originally planned, no matter how cool it is. As far as challenges goes, this is kind of actually funny. Trying to get everybody in a collaborative frame of mind and getting things done well requires a great deal of coordination. Thus the project management tool, thus deadlines, statuses, etc., etc. You just need to basically make sure everybody's on the same page and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. One of the other issues too is that you need to consider the return on your time investment. If what's more efficient? A lot of people I know think more people on a project is worse than fewer, and that's true. I think it's very much true. It's just too many cooks spoil the broth, and we all know that. Some things that you want to think about. All the possibilities of what could happen with... Sorry, my dog is sitting here dreaming, making those funny noises, if that's what you heard. I want to jump to unexpected events. These are all things that could happen, and somebody new comes in and things change. This happens all the time. New management changes their minds, changes the whole scope of everything. Phoebe, quiet. Sorry, I had to wake her up. Technology changes. Hello, Microsoft. Competitors come up with a brand new song and dance over there that's going to shake up your own operation. So you need to consider that. Natural disasters. A hurricane blows through. What do? People quit. People get fired. Lots of things happen. So you have to consider everything. In our little world where we're doing our project, lots of things could happen to you too. Your technology could fail. We could have bad weather. We could have a snowstorm in November and you can't get it all done. I don't know. Lots of things can happen. People could quit. People could drop the course. So don't get down. Just kind of figure out ahead of time how you're going to deal with that. Now, with our project management tool, you've looked at it already. You've filled out at least one business requirement. You're going to do more. There's an assignment coming down the pike here that I'm going to talk about that kind of brings together your research and what it is you're going to do, what it is the client wants you to do or you think the client wants you to do, into a set of questions. After that, you're going to meet, after you compose your questions, you're going to meet with the client and ask those questions. This is a jumping off point basically with the questions. You think of all kinds of great questions to go in with, and you don't ever get to ask them all. But what does happen is it gets the ball rolling. In other words, somebody will ask a question, and somebody will think of something to add to that question, or it will bring to light something you didn't think of. So that's what the assignment is. But before you do that, before you go in there, you are going to go and start thinking about goals and requirements and the kinds of questions you're going to ask to determine what those are. And then you'll ask them, and then after you get done with that, you're going to list the requirements that you came out with, determine the scope of your project, and that's going to be another assignment. Okay, so you've already looked at the tools, and I've already talked long enough. I've talked a half an hour here, so I'll leave you alone. Definitely go over and click those links on those videos. They're really good explanations of ways to manage a project, ways to develop an information system.